Well, the country continues to record a high number of COVID-19 infections, particularly in the coastal provinces. Now that vaccination is open up to 18 to 34-year-olds, can we actually expect those numbers to decline? Let's get an update from Alex van den Heever, a health and social security expert. Thanks for your time, Alex. Appreciate it. So I guess that's the question, right? We're seeing the infections go pretty high still, but we're now seeing more people get vaccinated in the past 2 days or so. Is there going to be a balancing out here at all?
I think there will be a balancing out over time, but not necessarily immediately. I think the increases in new cases that we've seen in places like KwaZulu-Natal are still running through. Probably, the upward surge was caused by the riots, because there was a downward trend before that. But the vaccination of younger people will potentially have an impact on transmission, because they are very often the drivers of transmission. But probably not immediately, but in between sort of 3 weeks from now to sort of a month or so, depending on how many people come through. But it is, if people come through in these numbers, it's very likely that it will impact.
Yeah. So you look at our infection rate, 14,000, well, infection numbers, I should say, 14,312 in the past 24-hour period. There's no sign of it going down. And of course, I spoke to the MAC chair during the week, and she was saying, the past 7 days are worrying. And if we see that continuing, then we might have to consider tougher measures. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that there's clearly a problem in certain provinces. So KwaZulu-Natal is definitely a concern. Western Cape does seem to be moving sideways, although it's argued that it's peaked. It hasn't yet got a very significant downward trend, whereas Gauteng still seems to be on a very significant downward trend. So a large part of the upward movement is Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, and I think that is worrying, and it's unclear just how dramatic the potential super spreading events were that have driven this upward surge in KwaZulu-Natal. But I think that we'll have to look at some sort of containment soon.
Yeah, and it would be a provincial approach, wouldn't it? Similar to what we saw in Gauteng when this province was the hotspot, where travel was restricted into and out of.
I think that would make sense, because in provinces where you're not seeing the upward surge yet, it would be better to kind of leave them alone for a while, but really to try and intercept this, and probably sooner rather than later. I don't think that the vaccination program is going to impact on these upward trends in the next month or so, which means a lot of people will get infected without really being properly protected. And it does take a while for the vaccines to have an impact on infections. So although, and noting, of course, that the vaccines are not completely, do not completely eliminate mild infections, which means that even if you're vaccinated, you can still transmit. But what one will be relying on is that quite a lot of the infections will be reduced, but just because of the vaccine. But we're not. I think it's still too soon for the vaccination levels to impact on these surges.
Yeah. So what's your current assessment of the vaccination process that's currently underway in South Africa? Because I remember in the early days you were quite critical of government. How are things looking to you now?
I think a lot better. I think the overall kind of mobilization has worked. I think that access to doses has increased significantly. Unfortunately, we're still having. I think that we could have done much better on Johnson & Johnson, but Pfizer has really come to the party. And at this point, the main obstacle is people coming forward rather than doses and access to vaccine sites. So I think that on the supply side, we're now in a much better position than we were. And this is the problem to have, getting people to the vaccine sites rather than not having doses. So I think this is hopefully going to be our biggest issue for the remainder of the year. And I think that the sort of roughly 60 to 70,000 person jump that we've seen by introducing the 18 pluses into the system is a really good move. And I think that these are really sensible moves at this point. We really have to keep the levels of vaccinations up, even if not everybody in the targeted groups is coming forward in the right numbers.
Yeah, and of course, the aim, many experts and government has said, would be around 300,000 vaccinations a day to eventually reach our herd immunity. How likely is that at this rate?
So first of all, it's unlikely that we will ever have herd immunity, and I think that is an issue that kind of needs to be understood. Herd immunity presumes that we've effectively reached a position of viral elimination because of vaccination levels. But because we're still having breakthrough infections, even with the vaccines, the main effect of the vaccines is going to be reducing severe illness rather than transmission. This definitely raises a concern as to how we should proceed. We do need to get as many people vaccinated as possible, principally to reduce severe illness and death, which is affected, and there is no indication yet that the vaccines diminish in relation to that effect. So we need to keep on. So the other issue is that the level of vaccinations that we're achieving is, I think, the right measure. We have the capacity for over 350,000 per day, and we need to kind of drive it up to that level. It really depends on demand at this point and where the sort of weaknesses are in demand. But I think that we will get significant numbers vaccinated this year. We will not achieve herd immunity, but we will possibly have an effect on a level of transmission, and we will certainly have an impact on, given the indications from other countries, on hospitalizations and deaths, which is really what our focus should be.
Yeah, Alex, I just need to try to get more information on what you're saying about herd immunity, because this is something that's been punted to South Africans by the President, by the MAC and the Health Minister, etc., as well as some experts. And you're saying that's not possible.
Yes, I think that this is the consensus internationally, in fact. So early on, when there was some uncertainty about the efficacy of the vaccines over time, the possibility of herd immunity was there. But what we are seeing is breakthrough infections occurring, and the levels of essentially the antibody levels begin to dissipate after about sort of 3 to 6 months, which means that it's possible to get infected, but certain parts of your immune system are still very responsive and prevent severe illness and death. So the problem is that we will probably continue to be infected, but the impact will be mild, much milder over time. So the idea of herd immunity is it comes through, for instance, with a polio vaccine or that kind of vaccine, which really provides permanent protection. And under those circumstances, you will never get infected. But this virus is showing that it mutates too quickly, and therefore there's the possibility of some escape of the vaccine itself. So I think that is really the scenario the world is facing, which is one of the reasons why people are looking at booster doses as well, not because they think they can eliminate the virus, but because they want to make sure that the levels of immunity from severe illness remain very high over time. And so they're worried about that starting to drift. So this is actually something that strategically all countries do have to face. Is that we're probably going to have to live with this virus indefinitely, and it's become endemic. And the question is whether we can reduce its impact on severe illness to that of the common cold and a mild case of flu. That's what currently the scenario is. But I would still say there is some uncertainty about what further developments will occur on the vaccine front, and whether there will be some further developments on the therapeutic front. And these really just emerge through time. And so I don't think that government was out of place in talking about herd immunity early on. They were really just following the sort of the general thinking, but it has changed.
Yeah, so let's say in a couple of years, do we look at COVID-19 as another flu where you go to the doctor, you get meds, you get a vaccination for it like you get a flu vaccine? Is that how we're going to look at it in the future?
It might converge on that sort of scenario where people who do have comorbidities might still require an annual booster shot or at least an updated vaccine for latest variant, which is kind of what happens with flu. but other people might not need to worry. But I do think, I mean, and this again will have to be sort of addressed by the vaccinologists and the experts in the field. But the question really is whether in fact whether this virus is actually significantly different to the flu virus, so that there is in fact an increased risk, and that more people would require booster shots every year, or at least updated vaccines every year for latest variants, because it has induced more severe illness than flus in different ways. So I think it's unclear, and I think that we just have to wait on developments and see what emerges. But as it stands at this point, we are looking at permanently living with this virus that hopefully just diminishes in severity over time.
Always insightful. Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate speaking to you, Alex van den Heever.